Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Grieving Voices. I'm excited to share with you today my guest, Jessica Fein. She is the author of Breathtaking, a memoir of family, dreams, and broken genes, and host of the podcast, I Don't Know How You Do It, which features people whose lives seem unimaginable and who triumph over seemingly impossible challenges. Her writing has appeared in Newsweek, Psychology Today, the Boston Globe, HuffPost, Scary Mommy, Zibby Mag, Kevlar, Veller,
Feller.
Veller, K is silent,
Mhm.
and more. Jessica is a relentless warrior in the memory of her dynamic daughter, whom she lost to a rare disease in 2022. Her work encompasses hope and humor, grit and grace, the tools that make up her personal survival kit. And thank you so much for your time today and sharing your story with my listeners and myself.
Thank you for having me.
And so I actually would like to start out um, by taking us back in time to how this rare disease came about, how you learned about it, what your daughter's name is, first of all.
My daughter's name is Dahlia.
Oh, what a beautiful name.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so I have a mom of three children. My husband and I adopted from Guatemala. So we had kind of a long and twisty road to parenthood and ultimately landed in Guatemala. And we adopted three babies, not all at the same time, 2 years apart, and then 2 years apart. And Dahlia was our middle child. And what happened was, in terms of your question regarding the rare disease diagnosis, she, from a very young age, seemed to be developing a little bit differently and a little bit slower than I thought was probably developmentally appropriate. Let's put it that way. So her speech was garbled. She was having balance issues. I had that mother's instinct and tried to get people to pay attention, doctors, early intervention. But, I was told just give it time, she'll catch up. And it wasn't until she was 4 years old that I finally got the attention of a doctor who said, let's do a hearing test. And at that time, she was diagnosed with mild to moderate hearing loss. And that was a condition that would be able to be corrected by hearing aids. But there was a question, which was why? Why did she have the hearing loss? Did something happen in utero? Did she have a virus early on? We brought her back to the Boston area from Guatemala at 6 months. So there were a lot of question marks. And we were sent for genetic testing, which really is a blessing because so many families have to fight for a really long time to get genetic testing. In this case, we got it very quickly. And that genetic testing led to a very clear diagnosis, another thing that doesn't always happen. And she was diagnosed at that time with a rare degenerative mitochondrial disease called MERF syndrome, which stands for myoclonic epilepsy ragged red fibers. Again, she was 5 years old, and that diagnosis seemed like crazy to us. We couldn't understand it, couldn't wrap our heads around it. She, while I had been concerned, never in my wildest dreams did my concerns lead me to the possibility even of something that grave. And she was the same person she had been, before the diagnosis. So it was very hard to understand. And even technically, nobody had heard of this illness. We didn't know what mitochondria were. We didn't understand what a degenerative disease meant. And so then we took off on a very lengthy journey that lasted until she was 17. Dahlia died 1 week after her 17th birthday.
Wow. And do children typically, I mean, what is the life expectancy generally of this?
Yeah, well, so to begin with, MERF syndrome is extremely rare. It's 2 in a million. So there's not really much data to go on. Also, Dahlia had a secondary diagnosis later on, which made her one of six in the world. So the thing with a rare disease is you just don't know. Now, when we look at MERF syndrome, what we understand is that people can be impacted even within the same family in really different ways. So, for example, when I Googled it that night, there was this long list of possible ways it could manifest. And it went everywhere from short stature all the way to death. So, I did what any mom does, which is two things. Number one, I read the list and I decided it was a menu and I would choose, okay, she could be short. I'll take that one. I'll take the hearing loss. That I could deal with. But when it got to things like dementia and obviously truncated lifespan, those I wasn't going anywhere near that. And I felt like, look, I'm the mom. I'll solve it. I'll fix it, right? Because that's what we do. We think we can fix things. And that was a big transformation for me. One of the ones I cover in my book, which is understanding that there are things we can't in fact fix. What do we do with a world that seems so wildly out of control, and how do we create any kind of meaning in that situation?
How did you do that?
Yeah, well, it was a long journey because, like I said, I decided I was going to fix it. And remember, I didn't even know what mitochondria were. So, I mean, the idea that I would fix it was totally fantastical. But and I really did try to do everything I could. And I became a big advocate and I looked for every study and I wanted to like travel the world and look for some kind of, miracle. But ultimately, what happened was Dahlia's disease, being degenerative, getting more and more serious. When she was 9, we were in the hospital for 3 months. And at that point, she had a tracheotomy, which meant she had a hole in her neck with a tube that she began to breathe, that she could breathe out of because she had lost the strength in her lungs to breathe. And she was ventilator dependent and she had lost her ability to speak and to eat and to um, move it, walk at all. Ultimately, she lost her ability to move at all. But at that point, she was just in a wheelchair. She could move her arms and she could shake her head and point and things like that. So she became too weak to participate in any studies. And I had a choice at that point because here was Dahlia who just wanted to be a kid. Like she wanted to have fun and snuggle and read and bake, even though she couldn't eat, and live a life and have a childhood. And as the mom, it was my job to facilitate that. And I learned from her in that respect. And I decided that I could not cure this disease. I would do everything possible to try to make the symptoms less, to try to understand the nuances of how she could feel better with everything she was dealing with, but also to understand that I had 3 kids who wanted to be kids.
I'm sitting here and I'm just thinking, attempting to put myself in your shoes. And as a mother, parent, it's so difficult to watch your children. It's like you said, the grief of wanting to give them their childhood, them wanting to feel like a child.
Yeah.
What were some of the things that, I mean, I know you did your own research but what did that look like? How did you do that? And what were some of the things that helped you, advice that people gave? I mean, did you connect with other parents who
Yeah.
became full-time caregivers and, of
Right. So, and first of all, yes, we seeing your child suffer is unbearable. And look, yeah, I have a 17-year-old. And yesterday I got a text, a very healthy mainstream 17-year-old. Okay. And so he was at school yesterday and something happened in one of the classes and a couple of the kids were mean to him. And he texted me. I mean, he was not even that upset about it, but I was like, wait, are they being mean to you? And he was like, kind of. And I was like, totally devastated and my stomach hurt. And I was like, wanted to like run into the high school and be like, stop, So that's how we are as parents, right? So what do you do when you have, this very as serious as it gets situation? And, I did not at the time connect with too many other people. I did become part of Mito Action, which is the mitochondrial disease advocacy and research education group, and I am actually on the board of that. But I didn't at the time connect with too many other parents. I have since my daughter died connected with way more people in the community. partly because of my own podcast, partly because of my writing. So I now know so many people, and I do know what a lifeline other people going through it can be. And it doesn't need to be people go, it's not going to be, in my case, other people whose kids have Murph syndrome. It's too rare. But it's other people whose kids are medically complex or have rare diseases, who are of child loss, who, have intense special needs, all those things. Parents whose lives look so dramatically different than what they had envisioned. But at the time I didn't, and there were a few reasons. Number one, I didn't have time. I was working full time. My daughter was an eyes on patient from age 9 to 17, which meant she was home, but our home was an ICU of sorts. And myself or my husband or a nurse trained specifically in her care had to have our eyes on her 24/7. It was very intense, and I became a highly skilled medical provider of her medical needs. I mean, it was intense. And so between working full time and then being a full time caregiver and then trying to create this childhood and this environment for my three kids and also writing a book at that time, I didn't really have time to connect with many people in the community. So, to your question of what did I do, um, I first of all am so, so, so lucky to have a great partner in my husband. And that's not always the case. I mean, you have single parents going through something like this, or you have parents who aren't on the same page. And we know that more than 50% of couples who have a kid with special needs, let alone living on the precipice medically, split up. So that was a real blessing, and for us that we had each other. And I have um some other, really close friends. I didn't see people very much, but people that I knew were there and were in my corner. And also my husband and I trying to give each other some space to have some time to ourselves, because that can so easily get lost in this situation. And I will say, because I know we're talking about grief in general, that a couple of things along this journey, I did lose all of my family members in terms of my family of origin. And that is part of my story in my book, which is losing two sisters and three parents, which happened along the way. And so I'm very um, reluctantly familiar with all kinds of grief. And it's not just the grief of losing somebody, but it is other kinds of grief, what I call non-Hallmark card kinds of grief, right? So ambiguous grief, for example, was something that I became very familiar with. I'm not sure if that's something that you've talked about much on your show, but there are so much loss that can even precede or surround or be separate from loss that comes from a death.
Yeah, I just talk about grief, whether
Yeah.
it's I the labels might be helpful, you know, to understand it, but
Yeah.
as far as like healing and stuff like that, I don't know that I yeah, it's just all grief to me. But
Yeah. Well, for me, it was a real eye opener because I didn't understand that there were other kinds of
mhm.
grief. And I didn't feel like it was appropriate at the time to be grieving when my daughter was here and was in front of me and was
Mhm.
alive. And I really, for me, it was such an important thing to understand that there are other kinds of grief and it is okay. And we can grieve a life we had imagined, and we can grieve a voice we'll never hear again, and all of these other kinds of things. We can grieve for somebody who's still alive. And for me, that was very helpful, because once I understood that this was valid and that this was real and that this had a name, it took away some of the power and it allowed me to integrate that grief and to move forward more effectively.
So you lost three parents and your two sisters during that 8-year span that it was 24/7.
Well, my I mean, my first sister actually had died when she was 30. So that, and I was 27. So that was the first major, major loss. And then my mother and um, and my father and my father-in-law died during that time, as well as my older sister.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. And it wasn't like they were all together. It wasn't like everybody was, sometimes when you think about a whole family dying, it's like, well, they were all in a car.
Mm-hmm.
Not saying that it's not like a hierarchy, it's not better or worse,
Right.
whatever, but this was like one-offs. And it was also not like there was something that was running in the family. This was like just, all different kinds of things. So it's pretty inconceivable. And yet it's what happened.
And yet here you sit.
And yet here I sit, and it's interesting because I know it's like when I'm telling my story to somebody who I'm just meeting, it's like I have written about it, I can speak about it, and it's so much to take in. And I have two friends who are therapists who said to me, my goodness, if you were to come and just be telling me all this, I'd be like, oh, she's, I don't even know, there was some like a diagnosis of like, that can't possibly be true, that can't possibly be what happened, because it seems so crazy. And yet when you're in something like this, and underlying all of it is this intense care and intense situation and this life on the precipice, you integrate it and move forward. Like there's no time to to lay in the fetal position. Like there's no time to be on the bathroom floor crying 24/7. You cannot.
One of the things that tends to go to the wayside when the life like just throws, the shit our way, basically,
Mm-hmm.
is our self-care and just caring for the self. And so what did that look like for you amidst all of that
Yeah.
loss, grief?
I'm really glad you asked that because, and I actually talk about this in the book, working outside of the home was important to me. And I did get judged for it because there were people, even medical caregivers in our home, who felt that it wasn't appropriate for me to continue working. And to be clear, I was the primary breadwinner, and this life was expensive that we were living, and nobody questioned my husband working.
Hmm.
Um, but I will say that when we talk about self-care, part of that to me was getting out of the house and working in a job that I knew how to do, that I had been doing before I became a mother. That was very helpful for my identity. And that was also, I think, an important break during the day.
Mm.
And I think it was able to make me more present when I was home. So that was one thing. Another thing for self-care for me was, I'm not like a big exerciser, but um, I did start to do Pilates and just having this like twice a week that I would get out of the house and do this thing was also a nice break. Um, and then also when we talk about self-care, I think that the writing was important for me. I wrote the book while at my daughter's bedside. And I think that that was a really important outlet. And it allowed me to tell my story my way, which meant I was able to make some order out of the chaos. So I think those were things. Oh, the other thing for self-care is that my husband and I, as much as we could, did a date night. Until COVID hit, we really kept that up. And it was complicated because in order for us to go out together, we needed to have two people at home, a nurse and a babysitter, because we had these two other kids. And also the nurse was not a babysitter. She was not being hired to entertain. So we would need a team of two, which first of all is an expensive proposition. But second of all, we needed to make sure that they got along. I mean, I remember we had this one nurse and babysitter, and the babysitter was like part of our family. And afterwards she was like, I was really uncomfortable with that nurse. You know what I mean? So that's like a whole other dynamic. So it was complicated, but getting out of the house for those 2 hours on a Saturday night was such a sense of normalcy for us because our lives were so abnormal. So to be able to do that, and every night, every Saturday, we'd get in the car and we'd look at each other and we'd say, we've never needed a date more. And every Saturday night, it would be true, even more so than the week before, And so there were those things. I think it was I think what all of these things did, whether it was the writing or the Pilates or the date night or whatever, is my work, it gave me an identity separate from being the mom slash caregiver. And I think that's important, for anybody in any situation.
When you were describing you and your husband getting into the car and recognizing that you never needed a date night more, I physically like I just had this
That
like
is what we would do.
yeah.
Literally. It was that huge exhale and the looking at each other. And I always, it didn't even matter like if we were engaging on that date night or if we were just sitting there we had the one restaurant, it was close by. So we knew we knew what we were going to do. We would go there. We still go there pretty much once a week. And yeah, just to have that ability to be outside of all the other roles that had become such an integrated part of our lives.
I think that's a key point in what you said is to put yourself in a different role. And in that moment, you too could be husband and wife
Yeah.
and connect.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And one thing too, like people may be listening, and something that comes up for me as I'm hearing you share is many people who experience a child that is a lot of care or what have you, they have that support system around them, as in the parents. Sometimes even the grandparents move in to help support and care. And you didn't have that either.
We didn't have that either. And I will say that that was another thing I was dealing with. So my eldest sister had lung cancer and she was diagnosed in the middle of all this. And I was kind of her primary person. And it was insane. It was so out of the blue. And that was a whole other ride. So I was really torn. I mean, we talk about the sandwich generation, caring for our children and our elderly parents at the same time. This was like, I don't know, like a triple decker sandwich or something, because I had the sibling thing too. And yeah, it was really hard. And I think that what I was going through was compounded by the other losses. And those became so much more present for me because I so wanted to be able to just like, cry to my mom and be parented, right? And when for a while I was taking care of my parents, and then when they weren't here, it was incredibly lonely.
And that brings me to the topic of friendships. I mean, you probably didn't even have time for friendships, and maybe the friendships you had fell away because that's
It's
kind of what
interesting.
happens too.
I will say I'm very lucky that I have a circle of friends, people I've been friends with since I was a kid. And the reason I feel so fortunate about that is because I feel like meeting new friends when you're going through such intense things is so hard, right? Unless it's people who are also going through intense things. But it's too much to catch somebody up on. You know what I mean? It's just like, it's a lot. So what we were going through was so unrelatable, that people who knew me before, that became very, very important for me. Even knowing they were there, they weren't in Boston, they're all over the place. But knowing that I had these people was important to me. And I think that we see in grief, right, how hard it is to maintain friendships because people are so awkward and they're so uncomfortable and they don't know what to say. And God forbid they bring up your kid's name, which is all you really want to talk about. But they just don't know what to do. And this is such a problem, is that we're just, as a society, so uncomfortable. And it always blows my mind because I feel like grief is the single most universal thing. Like every single person is going to be a griever. And yet we're so awkward. We're so weird about it, where it should be the great unifier.
That's what I talk about on this podcast. Like, that's what I talk about. It is the one thing that unites us all, that none of us
Exactly.
differ on. Like, we are all grievers.
We are all grievers, every
All
single one
agree
of us.
at a
And you
hundred
think
percent.
like, and with all other life cycle events, we understand how to be there, how to show up, how to sit with somebody in all other life cycle things. And yet when it comes to the thing that is the loneliest and the thing that is the most universal, we don't know how to do it. We don't know how to show up. We don't know how to sit in the silence, right?
And that brings me to the question of how were you taught as a child to grieve and express grief, and how was it what beliefs were passed down to you about grief in your household growing up?
I don't really remember too much from growing up. What I remember with every cell of my being is the sudden death of my sister when I was 27 and she was 30. And she was my best friend, and we had been on the phone that morning, excuse me, and she died suddenly that afternoon. And that changed my worldview more than any other loss, even more, I will say, than the loss of my child. Because by the time that I lost Dahlia, which everybody will say the worst thing that can happen is losing a child. And I'm not saying what's worse and not worse. I'm just saying that that first loss changed my worldview. Because before that, I saw the world through a bubble, right? I was like in a bubble and that loss punctured the bubble. Then I saw the world through the clarity of the puncture, not through the hazy sheen of the bubble, right? It changed everything for me. And I think that I was not living with my parents at the time, but I had them as models of how it is possible to carry on, which they both did after losing their child, right? And so it was forever altering for them. And they were absolutely different people on the other side of it. And they carried on and they engaged in the world and they had lives and I think that probably that uh t- somehow sunk in that it was possible to have an other side, to have, a life on the other side of what seems like, how can you continue on?
What's your sister's name? Both sisters.
Yes, my first sister, and thank you for asking. Her name is Nomi, and my other sister who died of lung cancer more recently is Rachel.
Do you speak about them in your book too?
Yes,
Those
yes. I
losses?
mean, the book opens with the sudden death of my sister Nomi. It's not a big piece of it, but I couldn't tell the story without starting with that because it was so life-changing for me. And then Rachel's a character in the book because that happened much more recently and so out of the blue. I mean, they were both out of the blue, but one was like totally out of the blue, sudden. And then, of course, lung cancer we know can happen. When you're diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, often that means that you don't have a boatload of time.
What were the lessons that you learned from the loss of the grief of your sister, your first sister, Nomi, since that was the one that kind of cracked you open?
Yeah.
What are the things that Dahlia taught you about grief then too?
Oh, two very different answers and so important, both of them. With Nomi, what I learned was I never would, nor would I want to get over the loss of my sister. This is not something I was trying to put behind me. It was something I was trying to figure out how to bring forward in a healthy way with me because she is such a core part of who I am. And it was very important that, I mean, I would never want to not be grieving for her. Like, I can't even imagine that. So it was not, how are you going to get over it? It was, how are you going to move along with it? And that was, a learning because I didn't know much personally about grief before then. Dahlia, I learned everything. I mean, here was a kid who lost everything that a kid has. She couldn't move at all. She couldn't speak. She couldn't eat. She couldn't run. She couldn't do all of these things. And she did not become bitter, angry, all the things that I think I would become. She wanted to continue to have joy and not in a like uh kind of denial kind of way, but in a like, this is my life. Like, I want to be out there. I want to be experiencing it. So So watching her do that made me realize that joy and sorrow can live side by side. They can hold hands. You can have grief and you can have beauty and all of these things that I would have thought were mutually exclusive, fear and anguish and anxiety and, anger, all the things. And then on the other side, joy and fun and meaning and all these things, like they can all be intertwined. And in fact, I think they become stronger in the presence of the other.
I'm just trying to imagine how, like, did you compartmentalize, like when you would come into the room and like just, I mean, because you essentially have to, in some respects, like set your stuff aside, right? To fully be present with her.
Okay, I think I'm the queen of compartmentalization. I think I'm like, I don't even know if it's a good thing or a bad thing or whatever, but I do think it's key for me to being able to function. Because, here, the situation was too big to take it all in at any time. It would have blown us down. We couldn't do that. I compare it to pointillism, the kind of art where when you're standing up close, you just see the dots and you have to back up to be able to tell that it's, a canoe or a field or whatever it is in the picture. We couldn't back up. We couldn't take in the big picture. It was too big. We had to be real up close and understand what each point was and be attending to each point. And it wasn't until after Dahlia passed away that I felt that I could back up and begin to take in the enormity.
One of the things that I had a previous guest on, she's the author of Always a Sibling. And
Yes, Annie Orenstein.
yes, have you read the book?
No, but I have it, and I'm about to speak. I have an upcoming thing where we're going to be together, and she's coming on my show. So,
Awesome. Yeah, she is wonderful. And one thing that I didn't really think about until reading her book was that, and she came on my podcast, was that um, our siblings are the people that know us the best, they're the longest relationships that we have. And so for you, when you shared about Nomi and how that grief was harder in some
well, that's
respects.
right, because I had never been a day on this earth without her.
Mm-hmm.
27 years she was by my side. For
Yeah.
the second that I came into the world, she was like celebrating me. And we, there that connection, there's nothing like it. And I remember at the time, and I will say, she had been married for for 5 years when she died, and she had been with her husband 3 years before that. Okay, so I remember so vividly thinking, even right then, his goal will be ultimately to move on, right? His goal is going to be, here's a young guy and they had a baby. And ultimately, I mean, he'd always remember her, but this would end up being an 8-year chapter of his life. And his goal would be to move on. And I say that with all the love in the world for him, but that was the situation. Whereas my goal was to hold on. I never wanted to let her go. And yeah, I mean, a sibling relationship, I think it's interesting that Annie said that, and I understand it, because it is the longest relationship that they know you in a way nobody else will ever know you. When you have a good, healthy, great, and in my case, when you have a sibling who's your best friend.
Well, and also like she shared too, they fill the gaps of your childhood. Like
Totally.
there's certain they know your childhood like
Right.
nobody else, you
And
know.
that's why, earlier when we were talking about my friendship circle, I've got some friends that I've had since like 8 years old. And so I think they now have stepped into that role and they know all the players, and they'll remind me, remember when your mom, da, 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 because we all grew up together. And that's why those friendships are so important. I mean, for other reasons too, but right, they are the safekeepers of your history.
That's so true. Like I have friendships since I was in
Yeah.
kindergarten. Like we're still close and I cherish those. Yeah, for sure. Um, what is the one thing that you would say to parents who, and I know we kind of alluded to it or kind of started this podcast talking about how you have 3 children, but so many parents I know we're jumping around here a lot, but because you've had, such a variety of losses, but
Mhm.
um, when parents seem to struggle with the question, who have lost a child, how many children do you have? And, it's like, well, do I even get into it if I had a child loss? Like, if I have my kids with me and there's four, but I actually have five, and do I say I have five? Well, where's the fifth one? Like how do you navigate that?
Yeah. So what I would say is to every parent, it is entirely up to you at any given moment how you want to answer that question. If you are in a place where you don't feel that the person asking it is a safe place, or if you're with other people, or if you just don't want to get into it, say what you want. Say to if you've lost your third, that's fine. You don't have to feel guilty about that. This is up to you, and it is how you are going to feel best and safest. I will say I am the mother of three. I believe I will always be the mother of three. I often think about it with somebody who had one child and lost one child, but the inevitable next question always is how old are they?
Mm,
And then what happens is you find yourself apologizing to the person. Listen, I'm sorry, this is going to be really hard for you, right? But I got, because you know you're about to make them so uncomfortable. So it is a total minefield, as is so much else. The question, how are you, is a total minefield, right? Like, what am I supposed to, if I'm feeling okay in that moment and I say, oh, things are good. Well, then you feel totally guilty. Like, how could I answer the question that way?
mhm.
Right. And I mean, there's so much we make ourselves feel bad about. And we don't need to do that. We need to do what's going to be in that moment. And you could run into two people in the grocery store and feel like you want to answer that question two different ways. It's okay. It's up to you. You know, I will find myself, for me, I just can't imagine saying I'm the mom of two. I can't. Dahlia is such a huge part of who I am, you know, just like it's very, very hard for me when people say, oh, do you have siblings?
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking that too. It's kind of the
Right.
same sort of thing.
Yeah. I always will have two sisters. I mean, I'm the youngest of three. Yeah.
Well, that actually brings up another question because I didn't assume you had more siblings, but I thought maybe there was a chance you had more siblings and I didn't ask. And now now it's
I
so you've
know.
lost both. It's like you're orphaned in your family in a
It
way.
is like I am orphaned. Yes. Yes. I know. And when my eldest sister was diagnosed, we had lost our parents and our other sister. And she said to me, I'm going to be okay because no God would ever do that to you. And that's what she believed. It would be, there's no way that the reality that is my reality now that could happen. And I suppose as I get older, it will be less shocking because it'll be more in the natural order of things, but I'm nowhere near the age yet when one would expect that, you know?
That just made me well up.
Yeah.
Um, I know on your website you mentioned the personal survival kit, and you've talked about um, I think you have alluded to grace, the grace you give yourself, the grace you give others. But what does hope and humor and grit um, look like for you in your healing?
Yeah. Well, hope, I'm a big believer in hope. And I think what we hope for changes all the time. For a while, I hoped for a cure, and
Mm.
then that wasn't going to happen. Then I hoped she wasn't in pain, or I hoped we'd be able to have a successful outing that afternoon, or I hope, but the idea of living without hope is not compelling to me. And I think that we get to choose if we want to be hopeful about things, and we get to choose what we want to be hopeful about. As for humor, I think you can always find humor. I mean, as long as you're willing to open yourself up to dark humor, um, there's humor. I mean, life is ridiculously humorous and, ridiculously punishing and all the other things. But I feel like humor is important too. And in my writing, I mean, that is probably one of the things I hear most often is, oh my God, I did not expect your book to be funny. People will say, I expected to cry, I didn't expect to laugh this much. So, fair, warning or promise to anybody who's going to pick it up. Hopefully you will feel an array of things when you read the book. You got to have grit to carry through. I mean, you have to be able to pull on the rain boots and put yourself in the muck every day. And that to me was the grit. It was getting up and doing it again, day after day after day.
And I would also want to ask, because I did think of another question, I'll circle back to that, but were there any books that because you had books on your thing too, and you're an avid reader and you're a writer. So are there any books that you would recommend that you found most supportive to you as you were going through all of this?
Yeah. Well, I'm a huge reader. And I would say that for me, and when you talked about self-care earlier on, I didn't mention, but reading for me, and at the time in particular, I just wanted to read fiction, anything that's going to take me out of my situation. So I would say that for me. And then in the book, I do talk about three other books. One is or three other authors who meant a lot to me. One was James Baldwin, whose life situation couldn't have been more different from mine, but wrote so much about people meeting tragedy and standing up to tragedy rather than letting it blow them down. And that was very important to me. Also, Mary Oliver is an amazing poet, and her work just really, really was very important to me. And then my father was a writer, and reading his words and understanding what he had to say about loss, he had written a book about the loss of my sister. So that was very important to me as well. Yeah, it was. And I quote him quite a bit in my book.
That's beautiful. You also have on there corners of beauty. What is that?
Yeah, and that's a big part of my book as well, which is this idea that I'm talking about a letter that I received from my father. He had left me some letters to read after he died. And we talk about creating a world of beauty, and where that's like a really tall order. And none of us really can do that effectively. We're not that powerful, but we can create corners of beauty. That's something that's within each of our control. And that can be how you respond to somebody you see out in the world who maybe needs a hand. That can be how you make something out of a lousy situation, a horrible situation. That can be having a candlelight dinner in your daughter's room next to the beeping monitors. You've created a little corner of beauty. So corners of beauty is something that I think is in all of our control.
Ooh, that's juicy. That is really juicy. I think there's something there for you to really dig into and elaborate on if you haven't already. I'm not assuming you haven't, but if you haven't, like that's very intriguing to me. I love that. Thank you for
Thank
sharing.
you. All right. So maybe that's the follow-up book.
um and then also writing it down, and of course, because you had that on your website as well, writing it down, and writing was very much therapeutic for you, it sounds like, at the
Right.
bedside of your daughter, and
Yeah.
and having that emulated for you too by your father. I bet that was such a gift.
It really was. And, one of the things that I learned from it was that his book was not a book about my sister. When he handed me the manuscript, he said he wrote a book about Nomi, and I read it and I said, this isn't a book about Nomi. This is about your Nomi. If I were to write a book about Nomi, it would be a totally different book. And that was really important to me. I'm sure if my husband were to write a book about what we went through, it would be a totally different book, right? I mean, people are so different for each of us. And even the very same loss or the same situation, two parents of the same kid or two siblings of the third sibling, it's a different loss.
Because all relationships are unique.
Exactly.
And so how can I ask, this is my last question, and because you brought it up and I actually wrote it down, husband grief. Like how did
Yeah. It's totally different. I mean, he would never in 1,000,000,000 years have a conversation like we're having, right? I would talk about this all day long because for me, it's an opportunity to bring my family, my losses forward, to have them be present, to tell their stories, to allow people to get to know them. So it's very, very important for me. And I am so grateful for the opportunity to do that. My husband is much more private, so he's very supportive of me doing what I want to need to do, but, I mean, he doesn't even like to come to my book readings. He'll, like, sit in the back row and maybe, so he can sneak out if he needs to because he's a much more internal private person, and I think that that's, we need to be able to respect that we're all gonna go through it in our own way, and there's no wrong way, and there's no timeline. That's a big thing. I see a lot of people. I see a lot of people out there who say, "Well, geez, it's been X number of, why isn't that person over it yet?" And it's like, no, no.
That's really why I started this podcast, was to, banish the misinformation and the myths of grief and all these things that we're taught, like time heals and grieve alone and replace the loss. And, these behaviors that we find ourselves doing to bypass our feelings and not feel them, right? And to feel better in that period of time. And so, um, what may have destroyed another couple sounds like it really just brought you two together and allowed you each to honor each other, the losses, and the way that you found helpful for you as individuals. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Where can people, well, let me ask you this first. Is there anything that you would like to share that you don't feel you've got to, that you feel is important?
No, I think that this covered it. And I love, as I mentioned, connecting with people on these topics, and I invite people to connect with me on social or well, first, please check out the book, wherever you get your books, whether that's Amazon or bookshop.org, Barnes and Noble, Breathtaking. And I'm having some really interesting conversations with book groups who are reading it together, and I'll go to any book group. I'll Zoom in or whatever if people choose to read it with some friends. And then yeah, my website is where I keep up to date on everything in terms of other writing I'm doing, events that are happening. So yeah, you can check that out at jessicafeinstories.com, and that's Fein, Fein, because most people hear it and think it's the other way. So jessicafeinstories.com.
Yeah, and we say fine in grief recovery, we say fine as feelings inside not expressed, and that is not you. So
That is, that's right. That's very funny.
um, I look forward to checking out myself. I love me some dark humor. So thank you so much for being my guest. I will put all of the links in the show notes. And um, thank you for sharing your warrior story. Really, it's a warrior through grief. And, we all don't have to do some grand things with our grief and share it with the world, but if you can connect with other people, like, and create those corners of beauty like you shared, that's healing. So thank you for sharing your story, because storytelling is healing too.
Storytelling is healing. And I also, I didn't mention I do a column in Psychology Today called Grace in Grief. You can find that online. And I write a lot about not only our own individual grief, but how you can support others in their grief. So if people want to check that out.
Thank you so much. And remember, when you unleash your heart, you unleash your life. Much love.